Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. All right, so what we'll be doing in this class today is to examine a very fascinating and robust, but very, very technical topic, which is colonial education, decolonization, and nationalism in Lagos. Okay, so we want to understand the factors that aided the establishment of colonial education, or what is known as Western education in Lagos, fundamentally. So why did the colonial powers establish schools in Lagos? That is a very critical question that should preoccupy our thoughts. By the mid-19th century, there was growing governance concern. There was also the burgeoning trade in agricultural commodity produce, which is known as the legitimate trade. All right. And all of this, both the governance and commercial imperative, required that some educated people should play one role or the other in the business of colonial enterprise. It was necessary for people, considering that the new colonial state, all right, had its own indigenous cultures, all right, including language. So it was necessary for a means of communication to exist, all right, between the administrators and also the commercial interests in Lagos. So educated Africans were needed in large number in colonial public civil service, and also they were also seen as semi-elite, all right, by their counterparts. It was necessary for some form of education to replace what was already available in Lagos. For those who started in 100 level, all right, before the D student joined, in our 100 level class, we had already established the role which education played, all right, generally in pre-colonial Lagos. But before coming to the impact of religion, education, in Lagos, one thing we've noted in our 100 level class is that education plays a major role in the dynamic development, the socioeconomic and political configuration of states, of entities, communities, all right, generally across the world. It is not just about Lagos. So without education, I believe there wouldn't be anybody in this class who would be able to effectively function, all right, among its peers in this 21st century. So education provides some kind of mode of operation, right? And that was exactly what was perceived in the colonial institutions, all right, which education plays a pivotal role. And as Walter Rodney stated, economic development lies in the capacity of humans, all right, to exploit their environment for survival. So without education, it would be probably absolutely a Herculean task for people to navigate the complex terrain of the commercial world, the political realm, all right, the economic issues and all of that. So human capacity to refine nature is determined by the overall level of education. All of you here, you are here to acquire education in the university just for you to, not because you just want to be a historian, you want to practice as a historian or be a professor, but so that education could refine whatever you engage, all right, whether you want to be a vulcanizer, you want to be an engineer, you want to be an administrator, a diplomat, a journalist, all right, an administrator, a manager. So it is the refinement which education produces that make this significant contribution. So as humans interact with the natural world to advance their material condition, education stimulates further intellectual development. All right, so we established this vividly in 100 level when we're looking at education up to the 19th century. So in particular, basically, in the 21st century, social development depends on engagement in this process of societal improvement. People transform the society, and there is no development in the international system that has not been well rooted, all right, in social consciousness which education provides. The series of revolution that has redefined, all right, revolutionized human endeavors since history has been predicated on the new methodologies, new approaches to works, to life. All right, the maritime revolution in the 15th century, all right, was as a result of the Enlightenment in Europe. All right, when Europe realized that it had lived in what is known as dark ages for several centuries, with the rediscoveries of some of the ancient writings of like Aristotle and other Asian philosophers. It was as a result of this that Renaissance occurred in Europe. Other revolutions like the scientific revolution, industrial revolution, and all of this, even the current IT revolution in information and communication technology would have been absolutely impossible if there were no improvement in learning, if people didn't realign or to redefine the core of their knowledge or to query what they already know. So in 100 level, we also noted that in pre-colonial African society, especially in Lagos, all right, education also played a fundamental role, provided the basis upon which the society thrived in the pre-colonial era, all right, and individuals, adopted one forms of education, means of educating themselves, all right. The pre-colonial society, contrary to some of the Eurocentric uh, assumptions, all right, about Africa, that Africa had no history, that Africa was primitive, was underdeveloped, uncivilized, and barbaric. The pre-colonial African social formations had its own unique systems or forms of educating its people. All right, there were institutions, there were systems put in place in different parts of pre-colonial society. All right, which of course it was not Western, it was traditional, it was indigenous. So these indigenous forms of education, engendered inclusive development. It brought about innovation and creativity, which sustained the pre-colonial African society for several centuries before the advent of the Europeans. All right, so for instance, this kind of education, as we've noted in our 100 level class, was anchored on the collectivist setting of the African pre-colonial state, where people were nurtured to the importance of putting their society ahead of individual glorification, all right, through a kind of system of apprenticeship. All right, the way to explain this form of education is to use the modern day Igbo apprenticeship system, where children were placed under the tutelage of professionals in the societies, people who had one expertise or the other, maybe in craftsmanship, in goldsmith, for instance, in salt making, canoe building, fishing, hunting, farming, and what have you. So these were some of people were placed under the tutelage of people to understudy. This was the informal system of education that prevailed in the pre-colonial society. So in the colonial period, due to the formation of the global capitalist division of labor, the colonial administration had no need to develop Africa in mass, because their aim, the modus operandi, the imperative of colonial capitalism was to extract raw materials which are only required little formal education, right, and training. So it was in the 19th century, basically, that Western education was introduced to Lagos, as it was in other parts of Africa. Even then, the formal education, all right, the process involved destroying the traditional or indigenous or collectivist system of education, of learning, basically by alienating people from their communities, from their culture. So one of the things that, it was the Palestinian poet Muri Baguti who noted that the only way to first dispossess a people, to exploit a people, to colonize a people, is to undermine their social and cultural values. Is to tell them that they are primitive, they are uncivilized, all right, they are not refined. So one of the things the colonialists did, Europeans did, was to undermine these indigenous forms of educations that were in existence before the 19th century. So look at some of the colonial, the nature and the characteristics of the colonial education system, the challenges it faced, and we'll look at the impact it had on the people, on Lagos and its environs. That is one of the key. I've already noted at the beginning that the introduction of Western education was predicated on the need, all right, to produce educated people who could read and write in English, who could communicate and contribute meaningfully to the everyday business of colonial enterprise in Lagos. All right, don't forget that with the abolition of the slave trade, all right, and the inauguration of the legitimate trade in agricultural produce, all right, palm oil, cocoa, rubber, and granite and all the stuff. It was germane for the emerging African merchants and businessmen to communicate, all right, with the Europeans. It was also needed with the annexation of Lagos, all right, and the imposition of the certificate of subordination, colonialism on the indigenous people. It was necessary for the colonial administrators, colonial government to recruit people, all right, indigenous, all right, into the colonial civil service. So how would some of these people function in the colonial civil service if they are not capable of interacting, all right, in the language of their colonizers? All right, so it is very, very important. So officials, of course, there were skepticisms, there were doubts in colonial circles about the danger, the peril of introducing Western education, giving some of these natives Western education. For instance, the colonial officials feared that educated Africans ultimately would demand more freedom, when met with stiff or hard limits to social mobility in colonial society. So there were this concern, all right, among the Europeans, among the British government in Lagos, that should we give these people education, even though there was the rising need for people to feel or to play one role or the other in the colonial civil service system. Apart from the skepticism, there was also the high cost per head, all right, of training Africans. Basically, as one of the key colonial officials stated, that the high cost per head is a necessary result of our African policy, born of vital experience in India, a policy of caution and firm foundation, advancing from a few selected and well-equipped centers in slowly widening the circle. All right, so it is in this context that Europeans, the colonizers, the British, rationalized the need to introduce Western education. Some were of the opinion that education should not be given, but there was also the need also to also introduce some form of education, which I'm going to demonstrate. Again, let me go back to our 100-level class, Lagos and its environs, up to the 19th century. We were able to identify a few of the institutions, schools, right, that was established by the colonialists. I think for some of you who remember vividly, the first of them was the CMS Grammar School in Lagos in 1859. So the CMS Grammar School was first established. This school was modeled along the pattern of the English Grammar School, and it was established in Bariga. So how many of you have been through Unilag Akoka Road to Bariga? So you must have seen the CMS Grammar School. That was the first, all right, secondary school. Let me clarify that the focus in this class basically is to look at the secondary education, all right, in our HSS, in our Lagos and its environs. What's the code again? In 100 level, we had examined the introduction of primary education. So now we look at the impact of secondary education now. We're going to look at, so apart from CMS Grammar School, there was also the Methodist Boys High School, which was established by the Wesleyan Mission, all right, in Lagos. There was the St. Gregory College in Obalende, which was established by the Catholic Mission in 1881. All right. And I also mentioned during our 100-level class that as a result of the contestation, all right, the need to take care of these binaries, all right, between Christians and Muslims by the the second or third decade of the 20th century, there was there was a need, for the colonial government to also uh, ensure that various sensitivities were recognized in Lagos. That is, that the education that was provided in Lagos was strictly focused on the Christian community. So as a result of several agitations, we noted in our 100 level class how new model schools evolved in Lagos, especially Muslim or Islamic schools. For instance, it was under this circumstance that the Gaskia College in 1943 emerged, of course, Ahmadiyya College in Agege, which is now Ansarul Islam model in Agege, also was established. Subsequently, there was the Sakatinumbu Secondary School at Eledata in Lagos. All right, and there is Ansarudin Grammar School and all of that. So apart from the ones I've mentioned, there were quite a number of schools, all right, which secondary schools that emerged also in Lagos. For instance, the Methodist Girls High School. So it is important to note at this juncture that most of the schools established in Colonial Lagos, especially from the 20th century, had their specific targets. They had the module of Prandi, all right, what they wanted to achieve fundamentally in Lagos. For instance, the CMS Grammar School in Bariga, which was founded in 1859, was a Christian CMS mission school, which enrolled only boys. It was boys only. The Methodist Boys High School, also 1878, was established by the Methodist Mission, and it's only admitted boys. You have the Baptist Academy, 1885, boys only. The only exception for was the Methodist Girls High School, which was only for girls alone in 1879. And I think that was King's College. All right, King's College was established in the first decade of the 20th century in 1909. All right, the King's College was established specifically by the colonial government, and it was boys only also. So all of these were some of the initiatives put in place, all right, in a growing colonial society. All right. So we look at the nature or the pattern of colonial education during this period. So the colonial authorities made considerable investment in this colonial education, in this, in the establishment of secondary schools in Lagos. So the investment made were modest, especially given the fact that the sole essence of colonial capitalism, the reason for the introduction of colonialism itself, was not to come and transform African existential reality. Although there's been the rhetorics about the 3C, Christianity, civilization, and commerce. All right, one of the C, uh, says that the reason for the British intervention or colonial European intervention in African system was basically to introduce civilization, to rescue the primitive, the barbaric, the uncivilized people from their underdeveloped states. All right. So colonial government made considerable investment, all right, in Western education, but this focused basically on primary education. There was no genuine intention or motive, all right, on the side of on the part of the Europeans to assist Africa, all right, in coming out of what they themselves term or describe as underdevelopment. So they were careful, as I've mentioned from the beginning, about the kind of education they provide for Africans. They do not want to get into a situation where the education which will be given to Africans will be a tool, all right, of socialization and also enlightenment that will lead to the kind of decolonial movement which eventually occurred. So uh, the colonial authorities, introduced quite a number of initiatives which transformed the education. We're going to highlight some of them, but the point I should make is that it is not the growth of Western education, especially at the secondary level, was not a result of the efforts made by the colonial authorities in Lagos. It was more of the fact that Africans demanded more Western education, all right, and there were campaigns, there were struggles, there were all forms of agitations that went into all of this demand, which compelled the colonial authorities to make improvement upon what was already in existence. And I'm going to highlight some of these. So colonial powers, as I've mentioned, always have the notion, the fear that education will threaten their control. So giving these people advanced education would threaten their control. So primary education increased demonstrably, while secondary education was essentially scarce until the mid or early 20th century. So we look at some of the investment made. Secondary education was financed mostly by the colonies, all right, by the people in the colonial, living in the colonial state, basically, with no contribution from the metropole. All right, that is to say that it was from the surplus that the colonial government, were able to generate, all right, from the colony, that the education was supported. So from the proceeds of cocoa, all right, rubber, palm oil, and all the commodity produce, for instance, from Lagos and Southwest Nigeria, the colonial authorities, colonial government was able to inject funds into the secondary education that was established. Investment also tended to concentrate over time on marginal investment, all right, in education. So they were very careful about what kind of infrastructure or amenities the colonial government provided for the people, because they were not there. They didn't come to give you a kind of education that will make you come to the same level with a typical, on average, British citizen or in England. So they were careful. They only needed a kind of education that will facilitate the everyday running of colonial activities in Lagos, especially the running of the civil service, all right, and also the unbridled uh, running, all right, of the commercial activities in Lagos. So low level of investment made in the education through grants went to the missionary school. So a majority of the grants, all right, that the colonial government provided were given to the missionary uh, schools, which only focus on primary education. So in most instances, the missionaries who actually played a pivotal role in the establishment of schools were probably not allowed to move beyond primary education, primary schools. So they were only allowed to establish as much primary schools in Lagos. But in terms of secondary, it was probably seen as something quite excessive. And let's talk about the curriculum. What was the nature of the curriculum in some of these schools established by the colonial authorities? So the more practical and rudimentary education is, the more useful it will be. All right, it's just a matter of turning young natives into workers who speak and write in English. This was a statement by a lieutenant governor in Senegal, for instance. So this shows that the interest of the Europeans, of the colonizers, of the British government in Lagos was not to give you, they only needed a kind of education that can give you practical and rudimentary education, especially in the context of the growing agricultural commodity produce. Don't forget that we noted in our 100 level class that with the inauguration of colonial capitalism, the colonial government instituted several botanical gardens in Lagos, all right, where in a way to facilitate the growth of agricultural produce, cocoa, for instance. So they needed people. Lagos was more of a plantation area, apart from the Lagos Island, the Kui, and so all of what we have as a Butemeta, all right, up to the interior, Agege, all of these were for cocoa plantations during the colonial period. So there was little effort made on the part of the European, basically, to engender quality education or improve education. So colonial education's end goal was to produce educated people to further Western imperialist agenda, which is quite opposed to the collectivist education which existed in Africa for hundreds of years. And in this education, in most of these secondary schools, what they had was an adapted curriculum. So the British didn't, export all the all of the curriculums, all right, that operated in England. All right, they didn't bring, the same standard of education, this, in terms of the subjects, in terms of the quality to Lagos. They only gave you what to only make or facilitate the growth of colonial activities in Lagos. So adapted curriculums refers to the idea that black communities required less advanced and more localized education, which was separate from, the European education. So British colonies, gave grants. The British government gave grants to missionary schools. All right, which focus more on primary education. So yeah, it's good to have primary education, but it is not so good to have, just as in contemporary period now, one of the, issues confronting this, public university is the attempt, all right, by the neo-colonial powers, the neoliberal institutions to undermine the functioning, all right, of public institutions in a way to avoid competition. All right. So you could see several times as we go on strike, complaining about the implementation of neoliberal policies on, public university. All right. And these were some of the issues. So the colonizers would not want you to have some form of, conscientization or enlightenment in a way to not to challenge. And we're going to demonstrate that in this class. So in practice, in most of the schools established by the colonial authorities in Lagos, students spend most of their days in indentured labor with no real education going on in the schools. I've mentioned that most of the schools, all right, in orientation, focus more on subjects that would enhance the easy flow of colonial activities, and also, the maximization of profits from the periphery to the metropole. How? In the context of agriculture, the British only needed the cocoa, the legitimate trade, to continue to expand. So the kind of educations provided in some of these secondary schools were the kind of education that would facilitate the growth of this agricultural business. So they were teaching agricultural science, all right, in which, students would understand the essence of the cash crop economy, and also the techniques to enhance the growth of this cash crop economy. There was also the CRK, all right, which I'm going to talk about, Christian religious Bible knowledge, all right, which was to make the people continually subservient, all right, to their colonial masters, all right, and all of these were some of the. So we look at some of the curriculum, the syllabus in primary schools and, some secondary school, for you to have a, in some of the primary schools, all right, for you to have a simple understanding of the nature of the curriculum. For instance, there were obligatory subject for boys, and there were also obligatory subject for girls. So some of the obligatory, I will explain the obligatory subject for boys side by side with. So in most boys schools, for instance, you have colloquial English and nature study, all right, which was obligatory for all boys in colonial, schools, but for girls, none. All right, obligatory subject for girls, all right, in terms of colloquial and English, was not, granted. For boys, reading with translation into vernacular, all right, the meaning of words and simple grammar, all right, was taught in boys' schools and also in girls' schools. Then your arithmetic was simply for boys. No, girls were not allowed to learn arithmetic. Probably they felt that the girl child was not capable of, relating more with arithmetic. So there was also hygiene and sanitation, all right, for boys and girls. There was manual training to include drawing or shorthand. Shorthand. How many of you grew up to meet the shorthand typewriter? So these were some of the subject taught. There was moral instruction, for boys and girls, and some of the optional subjects include history and geography. All right, only for boys. The girls were not allowed. Perhaps history was too complicated or too, complex, to be understood or comprehended by girls, so they were not allowed. Singing, all right, for boys and girls was allowed. Drill and physical, exercise was also one of the key subjects in the curriculum and all of that. So we'll start by looking at the impact of this colonial education. So the first of it, this impact is social mobility. Number two, political engagement. Three, social sources of disparity, and four, empowerment. So I'll further break all of these impact down. All right. So because I'm moving at a faster pace, so there wouldn't be any need to write on the board. So I mentioned social mobility, political engagement, sources of disparity, and empowerment. So this is how I categorize the impact of colonial secondary education in Lagos. Don't forget I've mentioned that the culture of elitist colonial education of the 21st of the 20th century gave way to a populist one, all right, starting in the 1920s, all right, as the colonialists' new interest in Western education increased school enrollment, all right. It increased school enrollment, and this is quite so social mobility, all right. This was a process that actually engendered the social mobility that people in Lagos experienced from the 20th century and beyond. So, for instance, the number of southern Nigeria who had completed post-secondary schools education jumped from 200 in the early 20s to 31,000 in the early 1950s. So you could see that gradually more people enroll, right? Even though from the onset there were doubts, there was skepticism, worry from no parents, right, about maybe the impacts, what the impact of colonial education will be, especially at the secondary level. Some parents lost the anxiety that education will be a means of misindoctrinating their children, all right, and making them to lose their African essence, all right, the cultural values, and making them reason of becoming like white people. And so many parents refuse to allow their children to go to some of these secondary school, all right. But ultimately, as I've said, the number increased, demonstrably from about 200 pupils in secondary school in the early 1920s to 31,000 in 1950. So Lagos had the largest share of school enrollment during this period. And primary school enrollment also increased also. Primary school enrollment of 1.1 million naira, 1.1 million people in 1950 was in stark contrast to the 140,000 30 years earlier. That is around 1920s. The primary school enrollment was around 140, and in 1950 it had risen to about 1.1 million. So you could see the transition, the rate at which education was embraced by people in Lagos, and this actually continues to explain the social modernity, the modernity, the development that was recorded in Lagos in the 20th century compared to other places, all right, that also received education in Nigeria. So by 1960, at independence, 20% of schools in Nigeria were in Lagos, all right, because Lagos Lagos is the gateway, all right, it's the center, all right, of activities. It had it was the political capital of Nigeria at the time. It had the presence of the missionaries, the expatriates, the Europeans. So of all the schools in the entire Nigeria at independence, 20% of them were in Lagos. All right, so expansion of literacy in English produced two complementary outcomes, two results. So what is number one is that it increased newspaper readership and sales in Lagos. All right, the fact that people could read and write, all right, gave them some kind of expression, all right, social consciousness in Lagos. These days, people don't read, your generation don't read newspaper. All right, even when we were growing up in the 80s, we saw reading of newspaper by adults was something, all right, a symbol of status, all right. They are the intellectual class society. So expansion of literacy in English produced two outcomes. One is the increase in newspaper readership and sales. Number two is that it provided opportunities for Nigerians to express themselves, to express their own ideas about living in a colonial society. So people can now express themselves. All right, and you see some of these effects when we start looking at the disparity and the political mobilization that it gave. So the content and readership of newspaper varied. There were people who read newspapers and contributed to newspaper publications, all right, on issues around constitutional reforms, all right. Those people became some of the leading elites and nationalists, while there were other people who were only interested in everyday conversations around the colonial society, all right, the issues of women, business, advertisement, and all of that. In So we look at the impact broadly now. So number one, the colonial secondary education paved way for social mobility and political engagement. I'm fusing them together. That is to say, those who had access to Western education had significant intergenerational impact. All right. What do I mean by that? No, they were those who, if you want to write about or investigate the history of the wealthy people in Lagos, all right, the businessmen, wealthy businessmen in Lagos, you will see that these people belong to the families of those who received education, all right, at the opportune time in the colonial period. Right, those who had opportunities of enrolling in some of these missionaries or colonial secondary schools in Lagos, and it's an intergenerational impact. You see some of these families in Lagos continues to occupy key positions. All right. For instance, I was reading last week about the governorship candidate of the Labour Party during the 2023 election, Gbadebo Rose-Vivour. You would be amazed that his grandfather were some of these people who benefited the first generation of educated people in Lagos who became judges, or who became merchants in Lagos, who play one role or the other in the business of colonial activities. Number two is that colonial education produced marked inequalities in the colonial society. There were big disparity in terms of access to education based on region, which I'm going to explain, based on gender, and based on religion. I'm going to explain all of these subsequently. Number three is that colonial Western education or secondary education produce disparities which have tended to persist into the post-colonial period, creating a class of intelligentsia and political elites. All right, social stratification in Lagos society. All right, so for instance, in terms of social mobility, again, individuals who were part of the first cohort to receive education at colonial schools in Lagos had higher living standard and better social networks compared to uneducated people. Okay, so some of these, imagine people like Namdi Azikwe, which I'm going to mention, who live in Lagos. All right, mention people like Obakomi Awolowo, all right, Taiwo Olowo, for instance. Some of these Ademola Adetokunbo, to mention but a few. These people had unbridled access to social networks, all right, and better living standard. They were the cream de la cream, in the Lagos society because of the education. They were able to navigate the complex terrain of the colonial bureaucracy, right, to get to the top of the civil service in the Lagos, colonial Lagos system. So the educated individuals were also much likely to be farmers. Most of them, were not farmers. They were much less likely to be farmers, but much likely to be politically active, and I'm going to explain. So most of these educated people subsequently became the people who championed the movement for decolonization from the 1940s and 1950s. I'm going to mention a few of them. So most educated young people had moved to big cities. All right, most of them traveled on the basis of the primary and secondary education they were fortunate to receive. Some of them were able to travel to US, to England to continue further studies, and very few of them returned home to become farmers, all right, or be involved in agricultural paid works and all the stuff. The few of them who came back worked in government establishment or private sector, all right, and they live in the urban center, basically. So in terms of inequalities, there was also spatial disparities and persistence, spatial disparities and no persistence. There were no, there were dichotomy between the development of secondary education in some parts of what became known as Nigeria in the 20th century. All right, with Lagos being the epicenter, the center of gravity, all right, of education. That's regional. But in terms of gender, I mentioned gender also, no, genderized. I'm going to mention, don't forget, when I was reading the curriculum, I mentioned that the colonial authorities no regulated what was taught in some of these schools. There were subjects that the boys were considered like arithmetic, like history and geography. All right, were subject only no was reserved for boys. Girls were seen as incapable of relating with arithmetic and history and government. So localities that had higher level of public investment in colonial education continue to have higher level of investment in later period, all right, leading to better outcomes. Even in today, take for example, the number of out-of-school children in Nigeria that Nigeria generates, 80% of them are in the northern part of Nigeria, all right. So you could see this regional disparity because the colonial authorities concentrated much of its efforts and initiatives on the urban center, especially Lagos, which is understandable. It's a port city, it's a center of political and commercial activities in Lagos. And this disparity continues to increase. For instance, in terms of this regional disparity and persistence, basically, in 1914, northern Nigeria had 8 primary schools, all right, 2 technical government schools, with total number of all the students were 512. Southern Nigeria had 541 primary schools, out of which 487 mission schools, all right, were 487 of them were mission schools, all right, and total number of 65,000 pupils. Basically, so that was 1914. Fast forward to 1950s, 1952. School enrollment amounted to between 900 to 2.5 million, right, children in northern Nigeria, and 120,000 to 2.5 in southern Nigeria, fundamentally. So I move on to the aspect of empowerment. Don't forget, I listed the impact of education. I listed what social mobility, political engagement, social sources of disparity, and empowerment. So talking about the empowerment now, how did colonial education, how did secondary education, led to empowerment, all right, among the people in Lagos, apart from social mobility, that they became wealthy, they were employed, and all of this. How did education empower, all right, the people? So the increasing demand for education, all right, despite severe restriction on supply of books, curriculum, expertise, had tremendous impact on empowerment in Lagos, particularly. The colonial group, the colonial group that emerged right from the 1920s were product of the secondary schools established by the colonial government, from the 20th century. So what the colonial government feared, all right, the skepticism they nurtured at the beginning was what actually played out. The fear that these educated people would use this education to react against us and clamor for independence. That was exactly so. Colonial groups saw education as a source of empowerment and continue to demand more for it. All right, British colonial officials in Lagos, for instance, remarked, and I quote, "Never in the course of my experience of the tropics have I found a place where people were so avid for education. It is the only country I fancy where the schoolboy, without being pricked, is more anxious to go to school than his parents are to send him. So people saw education, young children saw education as the only alternative to social transformation and social mobility and elevation in the society. So, and I'm going to give you a few examples of people who use the secondary education as a catalyst to becoming prominent individuals in the colonial society, at least in the first half of the 20th century. One is Nnamdi Azikiwe. Nnamdi Azikiwe is unfortunate that there is no projector. I would have showed you. I have some good graphics, pictures, data to show. But it's not my fault that there is no projector. It's something that we should weep for. All right, so Nnamdi Azikiwe, after graduating from the secondary school, moved to the US for graduate education, where he attained a PhD, in history, and he attained a faculty position at Lincoln University. So he served as the first president of Nigeria, as some of you know, and propagated the evolutionary vision on decolonized education. He played tremendous role in decolonizing the political landscape, but also the epistemic decolonization, decolonizing knowledge. All right. So he also went further to establish the one of the prominent newspaper in colonial Lagos, the West African Pilot. Most of you must have heard about that. His paper, How Shall We Educate the African, in 1934, introduced the need for African anthropology, ethnology, and ethnography, in secondary education. So he felt there was need for us to modify and redefine the curriculum in secondary schools, compared to what the colonial government emphasized: arithmetic, singing, Bible, religious knowledge, history, and geography. So the colonial authorities prevented the development of sciences, STEM, so what you call STEM subject, mathematics, physics, chemistry. All right, so some of those subjects that are capable of engineering, social, scientific development in the colonial society. So Nnamdi Azikiwe advocated for a total reform, overhauling or epistemic decolonization. That is decolonizing knowledge, beyond decolonizing the polity. So Azikiwe, for instance, stressed that technical and vocational training should be emphasized to the extent that Africans are educated as human beings, not museum specimen or fossil or preserved animal for scientific experimentation. All right, the Africans will receive the standard education, not so, and rather than help to create a collaborative elite. All right, as you can see what our own contemporary political elite are doing. They are collaborative elite, for the neo-colonial project. They are the ones aligning with the Western power, for the continuous neo-colonization. But the elites that emerge, the educated elites that emerge, from the secondary schools, in Lagos, were empowered, to become African nationalist leader. All right, and just beyond Lagos, where you have Amadu, where you have Nnamdi Azikiwe, where you have Abat Macaulay, Kufuor Abayomi, Ademola Adetokunbo. You understand? In other part of Africa, the results, there were resonances in other part of Africa, in Jomo Kenyatta, you have Julius Nyerere, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Patrice Lumumba, the Congo, and all of this. So these were people who deployed this formal education, to engineer political revolution, and social transformation in their society. So educated Africans went on to lead anti-colonial movement, the Pan-African movement that actually played the role, for the independence of Africa. They linked their struggle to the international socialist movement, and they also were able to galvanize support through group formation. For instance, it was these educated Lagosians, for instance, that pioneered the establishment of the Lagos Youth, the NYM, Nigerian Youth Movement in the 1920s, and which later metamorphosed into what is known as the West African Student Union, WASU, all right, which further, by 1945, again, a lot of momentum and were able to unite with their counterparts in Africa to establish the Pan-African Congress, Pan-African Movement 1945, which lay emphasis on the need for the European to relinquish the sovereignty, all right, and the resources of Africa for Africans. So, for instance, at the Fifth Pan-African Congress in 1945, these educated elites from Lagos joined their counterparts, all right, where they made a firm affirmation to the Europeans, and I quote, "We are determined to be free. We want education. We want the right to earn a decent living, the right to express our thoughts and emotions, to adopt and create forms of beauty. We demand for Black autonomy and independence." You could see the thought, the quality of thought and provocation, all right, of this altruistic, educated elite that emerged from Lagos, all right, and without forgetting, their emphasis was not on political decolonization; it was epistemic decolonization. Also, I've mentioned the role played by all of this Nnamdi Azikiwe by trying to reform the curriculum. But beyond that, they even went beyond this to clamor for more institutions. They struggle and they contended with the colonialists that the number of schools in Lagos and Nigeria were insufficient, right, to absorb the growing population. And their efforts led to the proliferation of secondary schools, not only in terms of number, but in terms of quality. And should you forget that it was through this agitation that the first technical college in Lagos emerged. The Yaba College of Technology in 1934 was established as a result of the effort of these decolonial educated elites in Lagos. And after achieving that momentum, by 1940s, there were more intense pressure for the colonial authorities to establish a university in Nigeria, beyond the Yaba College of Technology. And this was what paved the way for the establishment of the University of Ibadan, 1948, the premier university, the first and the best university. All right, it is University of Ibadan and the rest of them. All right, without going. So I'm a product of University of Ibadan, and you could see the vibes, you could see the tenacity, you could see the dexterity, the panache, all right, and the rigor. So, good product does not need advertisement. That's what I'm trying to say. So, in Lagos, as with Southwest Nigeria, all right, dissatisfaction with missionary education ultimately led to the institution of the free primary education, FPE, introduced by the central and indomitable figure, Obafemi Awolowo, Chief Obafemi Awolowo, like his counterpart, like other people who challenge the colonial system about the quality, the kind of education. Went further that even at the primary level, the education which was given was insufficient. And this was what led to the establishment of the FPE, free primary education in the 1950s. And this was the biggest expansion of education in colonial Africa, nearly doubling the number of primary schools in the region between 1952 and 1954. So through the effort of Obafemi Awolowo as a premier of Western region, more schools were established in Southwestern Nigeria, all right? And you could see the result by 1960, the growth of enlightenment, social mobility, political engagement, empowerment, and the rest and all of that. So over 50% of children between ages of 6 and 12 years were beneficiaries. Most of our professors you have now, all right, all the baby boom generation, Gen X, all right, were products, all right, of the free education system. You could see the depth when you interact with some of the professors who, in your 300 level or so, you'll be taught by some of these, professors in our department, Professor Akiyeye, for instance, Professor Ayodeji Olukoju, the HOD, all right. When you see the depth all right, you know that these people, you could see the quality of education, not the kind of jealousy schools that some of you attended, which were glorified, daycare, all right, in Lagos. So the FP provided a wider base for entrance into secondary school, trade schools, teacher training college, which quickened the pace of development of middle level manpower, all right, in Lagos. And in contrast to 1954, when 1 out of 5 pupils in primary school was a girl, by 1966, almost 2 out of 5 were girls. So what the FP scheme of Obafemi Awolowo did was to bridge the lacuna, the gap between boys and girls. Don't forget that for the colonialists, they didn't want girls to be educated. They only felt that girls were too insignificant to have good expression in the business of colonial enterprise or trade or bureaucracy, that the best they should do is to learn singing, how to sing hymns in church, cooking, and beauty, what you now do call makeup artists. Oh, you have makeup artists all around. Those are the things that the colonial, but by 1950s, when the FP was introduced, more girls were, integrated, and so in Lagos, where education was available, it became a source of empowerment. That is the point I'm noting. And the fact that Africans did so much with little education they received, despite the efforts of colonial powers to suppress dissent, highlight the transformational power of education for individuals, for families, for societies. All right, and Lagos, you could see the results in Lagos, the level of enlightenment, social mobility, and other stuff. So there were historical distortions, all right, which persisted into the colonial period, post-colonial period, but the expansion of education, all right, paved way for more improved education system, after independence and all the stuff. So let's look at the impact of education on decolonization. I've mentioned some of them, so I'm now going to identify the key actors and movements in this decolonial movement in Lagos. So from the 1920s, anti-colonial movement emerged gradually in response to the growing racialization of the state and uneven development policies of the British. All right, these educated people were the one who championed the struggle against some of the exploitative, the obnoxious and racial policies of the British. All right, in some of the next class, I think, when we'll be looking at housing development, you will see how colonial physical planning and housing scheme, were highly racial in nature, in terms of segregation of blacks from the white and all of this allocation of land. So these were some of the issues that Africans were contended with, the educated Africans. So the education they had received was a mobilizing tool, all right, for the development of decolonial action, all right, in Lagos. One of the major figures at the forefront of this movement was Abat Macaulay. Abat Macaulay was one of the central and indomitable figure which shook the foundation of the British colonial capitalism in Lagos. He confronted the British policies, challenged most of the British policies and actions that were quite exploitative. So this decolonial movement he led envisioned a genuine African social formation, African society, Lagos society, that is capable of developing at a faster rate, all right, with or without the British, without the colonial impact. So there was also the second decolonial groups, which so the activities of people like Abat Macaulay and his counterparts was what led to the establishment of the first political party ever in Nigeria. So you could see what education, the impact of education. So without education, how would they have been able to establish a political? Because for you to wrestle power, for you want to challenge most of the political, what you call political domination, all right, by the British. There's quite a lot to say about the impact, and I'll summarize it. Political party was established. There was also the role played by Obaileko Eshudayi and Abat Macaulay, who challenged the introduction of water rates in Lagos, and some of them also, like women actors, also played an important role in challenging colonial education system in Lagos, especially the genderized nature of colonial education.